We call it the cloud. It is one of the most misleading words in modern life, because almost nothing about the internet lives in the sky. When you send a message across an ocean, your data does not float through the air. It dives to the bottom of the sea. Roughly 99% of all intercontinental internet traffic, everything moving between continents, travels through cables lying on the ocean floor. Not satellites, cables, and most of them are no thicker than a garden hose. The entire digital world, every video call, every bank transfer, every frontier artificial intelligence model rests on a few hundred fragile strands of glass draped across the seabed. Even stranger, that traffic does not spread evenly across the oceans. It funnels through a handful of narrow choke points, places where dozens of cables crowd into the same stretch of water. The most connected system humanity has ever built runs through some of the most concentrated geography on Earth. This is the hidden map of the internet. So, what is this thing physically? Start with the cable itself. At its center are optical fibers, each about as thin as a human hair. Lasers fire pulses of light down that glass, carrying data at a large fraction of the speed of light. Wrapped around the fibers are layers of steel, copper, and plastic, and even then, out in the deep ocean, the whole cable is only about as wide as a garden hose. There are now more than 600 of these systems in service or planned, together stretching well over 1 million kilometers, enough to circle the planet dozens of times. They rest on the seabed, sometimes more than 4 miles down, in cold and darkness near the deepest trenches. A single modern cable can carry hundreds of terabits every second, more than 200, in some cases over 400. But a cable is useless in open water. It only matters where it touches land. Every one of these lines climbs ashore at a cable landing station, an unremarkable building, often near a beach, where the ocean's fiber joins the network on land. There are only a few hundred of these landing points on the whole planet. They are the real front doors of the internet. Now, look at what moves through those lines. Almost everything. That 99% of intercontinental traffic includes the world's money. NATO estimates that around $10 trillion in financial transactions cross undersea cables every single day. When a bank in London settles with a bank in Tokyo, the instruction travels by cable. And in the last decade, the ownership of these pipes has quietly shifted. For most of their history, undersea cables were built by consortia of telephone companies. Today, they are increasingly built and owned by a handful of technology giants. Google, Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft together now use roughly 2/3 of all undersea cable capacity, a share that was near 10% just over a decade ago. Google alone holds a stake in more than 30 cables. Meta backs the longest cable ever built, called To Africa, 45,000 kilometers of fiber, wrapping the entire African continent, connecting 33 countries. The same companies that run the cloud increasingly own the ocean floor beneath it. And the traffic does not scatter. It concentrates onto the busiest corridors, across the North Atlantic, across the Pacific, and along the shortest line between Europe and Asia, which is exactly where the map becomes dangerous. Because a system this concentrated has a matching weakness. These cables break constantly. Around 150 to 200 faults happen every single year. The romantic image is a shark biting through the line. The reality is far more ordinary. Most breaks come from fishing gear and ship anchors dragging across the seabed. When a cable fails, there is no quick fix. A specialized repair ship, and only around 60 exist in the entire world, must sail out, grapple the cable up from the deep, and splice it by hand. A single repair can take weeks. Usually, you never notice, because traffic reroutes around the damage. But where cables are few, the failure is total. In 2022, An undersea volcano erupted near Tonga and severed the nation's only cable. An entire country was cut off from the internet for weeks. And where cables are many, but crowded, one event can strike several at once. In 2024, in the Red Sea, 3 to 4 cables were damaged in the same narrow corridor, disrupting a large share of traffic between Europe and Asia, and one of those cables took nearly 5 months to repair. Years earlier, a single earthquake in the Luzon Strait near Taiwan cut 9 cables at once and crippled connectivity across Asia. The map has fault lines. Some of them are literal. So, who controls this map? The answer is not a single government. It is geography and ownership, layered on top of each other. Start with geography. The choke points. The shortest path between Europe and Asia runs through the Red Sea and across Egypt. So that is where the cables go. Around 20 cable systems cross Egyptian territory, and the national operator says its infrastructure carries over 90% of the traffic between Europe and Asia. A narrow strip of Egyptian land has become a digital Suez Canal. There are others: the Luzon Strait for the Pacific, the Strait of Malacca for Southeast Asia, a few narrow gates that most of the world's data must pass through. Then, there is where the data pools on land. An enormous share of the world's internet routes through data centers in Northern Virginia, in a cluster nicknamed Data Center Alley. Estimates of how much range widely, from as high as 70% in local accounts, down to a more conservative 30 to 40% by independent analysts. Either way, one American county holds a staggering concentration of the world's traffic. And ownership sits mostly with private companies, the consortia and technology giants that build the lines, not with the states whose waters they cross. The most public utility on Earth runs on remarkably private infrastructure. Because so much rides on so few lines, the cables have become contested ground, and the world is now scrambling to protect and diversify them. Recently, that contest turned physical. In late 2024, several cables in the Baltic Sea were severed within weeks of each other, including lines between Finland, Estonia, and Germany. Investigators found long drag marks on the seabed, apparently left by ships' anchors. Western officials raised the possibility of deliberate sabotage, and the vessels involved were linked to Russia and China, though the incidents remain under investigation, and intent is disputed. In response, NATO launched a mission called Baltic Sentry to watch over the cables. The deeper question is whether the world can build real redundancy. One proposed answer is satellites. Networks like Starlink, with thousands of spacecraft in low orbit. They genuinely help remote areas, ships, and disaster zones. But the capacity gap is enormous. By 2026, all satellite systems combined are projected to carry around 50 terabits per second, while undersea cables are projected to carry roughly 8,000. Satellites extend the network. They do not replace it. The more realistic redundancy is simply more cable. New routes that avoid the worst choke points, like lines running the long way around Africa, or fresh corridors that spread the risk. Supporters argue this diversification is finally happening. Skeptics counter that geography and cost keep pulling the cables back onto the same few narrow paths. Here's what all of it means, whichever way the technology turns. For decades, we told ourselves a comforting story, that the internet was everywhere, weightless, impossible to break. The truth is the opposite. The most global system humans have ever built rests on a few hundred fragile cables, funneled through a handful of narrow choke points, pulled into a few patches of land, owned mostly by a few private firms, and repaired by around 60 ships. This was never really a cloud. It was always a map, a physical, vulnerable, astonishingly concentrated map. None of this happened by design. Each cable was laid where it was cheapest and shortest, until efficiency hardened into dependency, the same way it does with every critical system. New cables are being built, New routes are being drawn, and redundancy is slowly growing. But the concentration is stubborn because geography does not move. So the single thing worth watching is not any one cable or any one outage. It is whether the map spreads out before a choke point fails, or whether the world keeps loading more of its digital life onto the same thin lines beneath the sea. The cloud, it turns out, has an address. It is on the ocean floor.